So how do we come to know universals? This chapter on our knowledge of universals is meant to account for that. Although Russell says in the beginning that we come to know universals sometimes by acquaintance and sometimes by description, it seems to me that what he explains here is simply the former, or only the former. How we come to know them by acquaintance. He says, let us consider first the knowledge of universals by acquaintance. It is obvious to begin with that we are acquainted with such universals as white, red, black, sweet, sour, loud, hard, etc., that is, with qualities which are exemplified in sense data. When we see a white patch, we are acquainted in the first instance with the particular patch. But by seeing many white patches, we easily learn to abstract, that's a key word here, abstract, the whiteness which they all have in common. And in learning to do this, we are learning to be acquainted with whiteness. In our ordinary sense experience, by having the experience of sense data, we become immediately acquainted with those sense data, and that we learn to recognize similarities in different sense data. And what we find there is that not only does this result, Russell thinks, in a gradual recognition of a common element, in this case whiteness, color, in different sense data, and therefore learn to become more acquainted, more familiar with the universal whiteness rather than with particular white things or particular instances of white sense data. It means that we're already acquainted with the concept of resemblance. That is, it's something that we find that we're already acquainted with. Otherwise, we would not be able to recognize any resemblance of any sort. So it would seem that some things that we're acquainted with, some concepts like resemblance, so that we can recognize resemblances, we find that we're already acquainted with them. We must be, in order to recognize the similarity between different sense data that makes us recognize the universal whiteness. So some things universals we become acquainted with through this process of abstraction. It also applies, he says, to relations. For instance, he accounts for or describes how we become familiar with, acquainted with the universal being to the left of by attending to the spatial relations between different things that we find in our visual fields. That we become acquainted, gradually familiar with temporal relations like before and after. Now this way of becoming familiar with, acquainted with universals is related to the earlier discussion of a priori knowledge. That is, some things we know a priori. That is, some things, and a priori means independent of experience, that our knowledge of these things is independent of our sense experience, independent of our experience of particular things too, which is of course indirect. And what we find is that recognizing, according to Russell, our acquaintance with universals that we obtain through the gradual process of abstraction explains our a priori knowledge, or at least puts it in some particular perspective. He says, returning now to the problem of a priori knowledge, which we left unsolved when we began the consideration of universals, we find ourselves in a position to deal with it in a much more satisfactory manner than was possible before. Let us revert to the proposition 2 and 2 are 4. It is fairly obvious, in view of what has been said, that this proposition states a relation between the universal 2 and the universal 4. This suggests a proposition which we shall now endeavor to establish, namely, all a priori knowledge deals exclusively with the relations of universals. All our a priori knowledge is knowledge about universals and the relations between them. That is, we find that once we become acquainted with certain universals, it becomes immediately clear that those universals have certain relations. For instance, that there's a certain relation between the universal 2 and the universal 4, and that is that 2 2s make 4. Russell believes that this is a priori knowledge, that this is knowledge that does not depend upon our gradually accumulating evidence of particulars. That is, we do not come to the knowledge that 2 and 2 plus 4 by attending to the fact that any two objects that we actually meet in the world, if we add 2 more, that we get 4 of the same object. It's rather that we may become acquainted with that truth in our experience of ordinary objects. But that truth itself, the a priori truth, is really about the logical relations, the inherent logical relations between certain universal objects. That is, we realize that these universals have certain relations between them. Now, this knowledge, this a priori knowledge, is a knowledge about universals. If we try to apply that universal to particular things in the world, there's always a non-a priori element to it. For instance, he says, no fact concerning anything capable of being experienced can be known independently of experience. No fact. We know a priori, that is, we know apart from all sense experience, that 2 things and 2 other things make 4 things, but we do not know a priori that if Brown and Jones are 2, and Robinson and Smith are 2, then Brown and Jones and Robinson and Smith are 4. The reason is that this proposition can't be understood at all unless we know that there are such people as Brown and Jones and Robinson and Smith, and this we can only know by experience. That is, the content, particular content that Brown and Jones and Robinson and Smith make 4, it contains, the statement contains an a priori knowledge that 2 and 2 are 4, but the knowledge that 4 human beings make 4 is dependent upon our knowledge that there are human beings, and that is not a priori knowledge. In fact, that is inductive knowledge. That is knowledge that is dependent upon our knowledge of particulars, and then we generalize from those particulars. For instance, he refers to the classic empirical generalization that all men are mortal. He says, it will serve to make the point clearer if we contrast our genuine a priori judgment with an empirical generalization, that is, an generalization that we make upon induction, that is, observation of particular instances which we then generalize into what we believe to be, on some evidence, of general truth. Here, as before, we can understand what the proposition means as soon as we understand the universals involved, namely man and mortal. It is obviously unnecessary to have an individual acquaintance with the whole human race in order to understand what our proposition means. Thus, the difference between an a priori general proposition and an empirical, that is, one depending upon experience, unlike a priori generalization, and an empirical generalization, does not come in the meaning of the proposition. We still have to understand universals, and to understand the meaning of the proposition, we have to understand the universal man, we have to understand the universal mortal. It comes in the nature of the evidence for it. In the empirical case, the evidence consists in the particular instances. That is, why are all men mortal? Well, we have to refer to particular instances. We believe that all men are mortal because we know that there are innumerable instances of men dying, and that no instances of their living beyond a certain age. We do not believe it because we see a connection between the universal man and the universal